It was 5:30 in the morning on February 25, 1990, in a quiet Florida suburb. Michael Schiavo jolted awake to a strange, heavy sound echoing from the hallway. Rushing out of bed, he found his wife, Terri, collapsed face down, half in the bathroom. She was unresponsive, showing no sign of movement, no cry for help. Panic set in. Michael grabbed the phone and dialed 911. The call was calm on the surface, but beneath it lay the desperation of a man watching his wife slip away. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They quickly scanned the scene. No broken glass, no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. To the police, it looked like just another tragic medical emergency in the early hours of a Sunday morning. But if this was only a health crisis, why did the questions start piling up so quickly? As medics worked to revive Terri, her body remained motionless, her breathing shallow. The police, while thorough, found nothing amiss. No drugs, no sign of violence. All they could do was note the facts. A young woman in her 20s, a loving husband by her side, and a sudden collapse that would change both their lives forever. Looking back, this ordinary morning marked the first domino in a story that would grip a nation, ignite a firestorm of legal and ethical debate, and ultimately force America to ask, who has the right to decide when a life should end? The Schiavo case would not be forgotten, but to understand how it began, we have to step back to Terri's youth, her dreams, and the relationship that would soon become the center of a storm. Rewind, portrait of Terri and her marriage. Before headlines and controversy, Terri Schiavo was simply Terri, a daughter, a wife, a young woman searching for happiness in a world that often felt overwhelming. Born in 1963 in Pennsylvania, Terri grew up in a strict but loving Catholic family. Her father, Bob, carried himself with an air of discipline, while her mother, Mary, was gentle and warm. Terri's teenage years were marked by insecurity about her weight. For years, she struggled quietly, her self-esteem rising and falling with every glance in the mirror. But by the time she started dating, she'd lost nearly 100 pounds. Friends remember her as cheerful, compassionate, the kind of person who'd laugh easily and make others feel at home. In 1984, Terri married Michael Schiavo. Their wedding, held in the family church, seemed the beginning of a new chapter. Not long after, they moved to Florida to be closer to Terri's mother's side of the family. Terri found work in insurance, while Michael managed a fast food restaurant. On the surface, everything appeared stable. They shared dreams of building a family, hoping to have children, though those dreams would never come to pass. Behind closed doors, however, the reality was more complicated. Their struggle with infertility cast a shadow over their happiness. For Terri, the desire for motherhood became a quiet ache. Michael, meanwhile, juggled long work hours and the pressures of a young marriage far from home. And yet, despite their hardships, there were moments of hope. Birthdays, holidays, quiet evenings spent together. In photographs from those years, Terri's smile still shines, giving no hint of the tragedy that lay ahead. But sometimes, the most ordinary stories hide fractures beneath the surface. Did anyone at the time sense what was coming? Or did everyone believe, as so many do, that life would simply keep moving forward, undisturbed? Only in hindsight does the weight of these early years become clear. A prologue to a conflict that would soon engulf Terri, Michael, and everyone who loved them. The cracks, warnings, and rising tensions. From the outside, Terri and Michael seemed to be weathering the storms of young adulthood, balancing work, family, and the unspoken grief of infertility. But as the years passed, subtle fissures began to show. Terri's old struggles with body image never fully disappeared. Friends would later recall her lingering obsession with weight and appearance, the kind of anxiety that never left her in peace. It's now believed she may have quietly battled an eating disorder, an invisible force chipping away at her health. The experts say that dangerously low potassium, often the result of poor nutrition or extreme dieting, can disrupt the heart's natural rhythm, sometimes with catastrophic results. Was this a warning sign that no one recognized until it was too late? Then came the morning that changed everything. The aftermath was chaos. Doctors, lawyers, family members all pulled into a whirlpool of confusion and grief. But the tragedy didn't bring the family together. If anything, it tore them further apart. In 1992, just 2 years after Terri's collapse, Michael Schiavo won a malpractice lawsuit against her doctors for alleged negligence in her care. The settlement was substantial, around $1 million, a sum meant to provide for Terri's lifelong medical needs. But money, as so often happens, became a wedge. The Schindler family believed they deserved a share. Michael disagreed. Tensions escalated. Lawsuits, counter-lawsuits, and a bitter dispute over guardianship began to play out in public and private. Meanwhile, Michael continued to care for Terri full-time, at least in the early years. But life outside the hospital did not stand still. He began seeing Jody, a new relationship that became ammunition for his critics, both in the Schindler family and in the court of public opinion. To some, it was proof that Michael's priorities had shifted. To others, it was a symptom of a man living in limbo, unable to grieve or move on. How much conflict can one family bear before something snaps? And when money, love, and duty collide, who gets to decide what's right? These questions would soon be put to the ultimate test, as the case moved from private heartbreak to the blinding glare of national scrutiny. The night of the incident, a timeline unfolds. February 25, 1990, began like any other day for the Schiavo household, but by 5:30 a.m., that sense of normalcy would be shattered forever. Michael Schiavo awoke suddenly to the sound of something heavy, maybe a thud, maybe a crash. He hurried out of bed, his heart pounding, only to find Terri sprawled, face down, halfway between the bathroom and the hallway. She wasn't breathing, her body unresponsive. The world seemed to narrow into one terrible moment. Michael dialed 911. The call was rushed, urgent. "My wife collapsed. She's not breathing." Paramedics arrived in minutes, racing against time. They performed CPR and transported Terri to the hospital, where doctors scrambled to find answers. Standard tests were run. Toxicology screens came back negative for drugs and alcohol. A CT scan revealed severe brain swelling, and further examination showed signs of brain herniation. Pressure so extreme, it threatened to shut down her body entirely. The diagnosis was as grim as it was clear: cardiac arrest, likely caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain. Within minutes, Terri had slipped into a deep, unresponsive state. The prognosis was bleak: persistent vegetative state, a medical limbo where the body continues, but the mind never wakes. Doctors explained to the family that recovery was almost impossible. Terri could breathe on her own, but required a feeding tube to survive. Hope, so present just hours before, began to flicker. Police, meanwhile, combed the scene for evidence. They found no sign of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, no suspicious substances. The official reports noted a tragic accident, nothing more. But for the Schindlers and for Michael, The questions had only begun. Was there something everyone had missed? Could more have been done? In the hospital corridors and quiet moments at home, these doubts festered, growing stronger with each passing day. Sometimes, it's not what you see at first that matters. It's what comes after. The relentless search for answers, even when hope is hard to find. The investigation, witnesses, forensics, and disputed motives. In the days and weeks following Terri's collapse, the search for answers intensified. Investigators pieced together the events of that morning. Michael's account, the police reports, the testimonies of paramedics and hospital staff. Each detail was scrutinized, each theory tested. The public, too, would soon become invested. But at first, the investigation was quiet, methodical, and clinical. Michael remained the key witness. He told investigators about hearing the strange noise and discovering Terri unresponsive. Police records confirmed his story. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a physical altercation. Toxicology screens, run by hospital staff, revealed nothing. No traces of drugs, alcohol, or other substances that could explain the sudden collapse. It was a medical mystery, not a criminal one, at least on the surface. Terri's condition did not improve. 8 months after the incident, doctors at UCSF attempted an advanced intervention, implanting a brain stimulator in hopes of triggering a response. It failed. Multiple rounds of rehabilitation offered no change. Terri's diagnosis, persistent vegetative state, remained unchanged. She could breathe without assistance, but required a feeding tube to stay alive. Financial matters brought a new layer of suspicion. Courts repeatedly reviewed Michael's management of the settlement funds meant for Terri's care. Each time, auditors found no evidence of fraud or self-dealing. The specter of monetary motive lingered, but was never proven. Some, including members of the Schindler family, speculated about darker possibilities, foul play, or neglect. But repeated investigations found no proof, no bruises, no toxins, no signs of deliberate harm. At the same time, the Schindlers themselves came under scrutiny. When the courts ordered Terri's feeding tube withdrawn, there were accusations that family members tried to surreptitiously provide her with nutrition. The court responded with strict limits, yet another front in an already bitter battle. If there was a crime, it remained invisible. If there was only tragedy, it was one that left every witness haunted by questions with no easy answers. The turning point. Critical evidence and a nation. Divided by the year 2000, after a decade of medical stasis and legal maneuvering, the Terri Schiavo case reached a critical juncture. New evidence, and the court's interpretation of it, would change everything. Over years of hearings and testimony, Michael Schiavo asserted that Terri had once confided to him her wishes. She would not want to be kept alive by artificial means if there was no hope of recovery. The Schindler family disputed this claim, insisting Terri's Catholic faith would never allow such a choice. The courts, however, found Michael's recollections persuasive. In 2000, after weighing testimony from friends and medical professionals, a Florida judge concluded there was clear and convincing evidence that Terri would not have wanted to live indefinitely in a persistent vegetative state. The judge authorized the removal of Terri's feeding tube, but this was far from the end. The Schindlers appealed, and with each legal setback, public interest mounted. The story exploded onto talk shows, cable news, and front pages. Politicians weighed in. In 2003, Florida Governor Jeb Bush signed Terri's law, granting him authority to order the feeding tube reinserted, an extraordinary intervention. Yet this, too, was short-lived. The Florida Supreme Court struck down the law as unconstitutional, reaffirming the original ruling. The battle shifted to Washington. In 2005, the U.S. Congress rushed through emergency legislation, hoping to move Terri's case into federal courts. For days, the nation watched as the judiciary, the executive, and grieving families clashed over Terri's fate. But in the end, federal courts upheld Florida's decision. The feeding tube would be withdrawn, and Terri's wishes would stand. On March 31, 2005, after 13 days without artificial nutrition, Terri Schiavo died. The final autopsy was conclusive. Her brain had atrophied to half its normal weight, the damage irreversible, her ability to feel pain or awareness long gone. For some, this was the closing of an agonizing chapter. For others, it was a moment of devastating defeat. This twist, the court siding with Terri's right to die, turned a private tragedy into a national reckoning. But the story was not over. The aftermath would ripple through politics, faith, and family for years to come. The courtroom battles, verdicts, and aftermath. The years between 2000 and 2005 became a relentless march of hearings, appeals, and emergency motions. Each new verdict, whether for or against removing Terri Schiavo's feeding tube, brought a fresh wave of anguish to her divided family, and fresh headlines to a nation now captivated by the fight. The legal process itself became a battleground, the courtroom a stage for the deepest fears and beliefs about life and death. In total, more than a dozen separate court decisions were rendered. At times, the courts ordered Terri's feeding tube to be removed. At other moments, emergency appeals from the Schindlers led to it being reinserted. Each cycle felt like a cruel reset, hope rising and falling, emotions running high in hospital corridors and late-night vigils outside. The arguments were wrenching. Was Terri's faint smile a sign of consciousness, as her parents believed, or merely a reflex, as doctors insisted? On March 18, 2005, after years of legal wrangling, a final court order was issued. The feeding tube was removed for the last time. Across Florida and beyond, protests erupted, some praying, some shouting, all united by grief and outrage. Police had to maintain a perimeter around the hospice. Threats were made, and for a brief moment, the story became a national security concern. In the end, Michael Schiavo, as Terri's legal guardian, oversaw her cremation and burial in a location separate from the Schindler families. The Schindlers, in turn, held their own memorial service, vowing to continue their advocacy for vulnerable patients. Even in death, Terri remained the center of two irreconcilable worlds. Was there ever a real victory here? For many, the answer is no. The legal resolution did little to soothe the wounds of those left behind. The Schindlers continued their campaign to protect life. Michael became an advocate for the right to die with dignity, thrust into the role of reluctant spokesman for personal autonomy. But the case of Terri Schiavo was no longer just about one woman or one family. It had become a national symbol, a prism through which America saw its own fears, hopes, and unresolved questions about life, death, and who gets to decide. Aftermath and lessons. A nation changed. In the weeks and months after Terri Schiavo's death, the debate did not fade. If anything, the public and political echoes grew louder, reaching far beyond one Florida hospice room. What began as a private family crisis had become a lightning rod, forcing Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about medical ethics, religious conviction, and the role of government in life and death decisions. Across the country, families began having difficult conversations at kitchen tables and doctors' offices. The phrase, living will, entered the national vocabulary. Hospitals saw a surge in patients asking for advance directives, clear legal instructions for what should happen if they were ever in Terri's position. For many, the lesson was simple and painful. Don't wait until it's too late to make your wishes known. But the Schiavo case did more than change paperwork. It exposed deep cultural divides. Protesters, politicians, and cable news personalities transformed the hospice grounds into a battleground. Threats were made. Law enforcement had to stand guard day and night. For some, the courts had denied a family's faith and hope. For others, the state had come dangerously close to overriding personal autonomy. Even years later, Terri's name remained a symbol, used in political debates, cited in courtrooms, whispered in family disagreements. Her husband, Michael, turned his grief into activism, campaigning for medical privacy and the right to die with dignity. The Schindlers, meanwhile, founded the Life and Hope Network, offering a 24/7 hotline for families facing similar crises. In the end, the tragedy of Terri Schiavo was about more than legal briefs or medical charts. It was a story of love, loss, and the limits of control, reminding us all how quickly the ordinary can turn into the unimaginable. The lesson: make your choices clear, protect your loved ones from crisis, and remember, sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones we hope we never have to make. The case of Terri Schiavo remains one of America's most haunting and divisive true stories. A tragedy that began in the quiet darkness of a Florida morning and exploded into a national debate about life and death and the boundaries of personal choice. Over 15 years, families, doctors, judges, and politicians all wrestled with impossible questions, their answers echoing far beyond Terri's hospital room. What started as a medical emergency became a cultural fault line, testing the strength of marriage, faith, and the law. For every answer the courts delivered, a new question lingered about duty, love, and who in the end should hold the right to decide. If this story moved you, take a moment to talk to your family about your own wishes. Don't leave it to chance. Make your choices clear, and help protect those you love from future heartbreak. If you want more stories that challenge, provoke, and stay with you long after the credits roll, remember to subscribe, leave a like, and share this episode with others.